And we're continuing with the 11th chapter of the Spell of the Sorcerer's Skull. This is the last chapter of the book. The professor is now explaining to everybody exactly what was going on. Fergie asked about the skull of Warren Windrow and why it didn't bother the Childermass family that Uncle Lucius had it, and the professor is answering him. The professor shook his head. No, they didn't know the skull was there. When Lucius showed up at the old homestead back in the mid-1850s, everyone must have assumed that a hat was in the hat box, and the old boy never let out a peep about his sordid little secret. Of course, they went through his belongings after his death, but, well, I'm getting ahead of my story. The professor paused to pull his burned-out cigar butt from the jade holder. He stuck a new one in and lit it. To continue, he went on, spewing clouds of smoke as he talked. The years passed, and things did not go well with Lucius. I got this part of the tale from my father, since I was just a wee kid when Lucius died. Everything he tried to do flopped, and in the end he became a gloomy hermit who spent a lot of time in his bedroom. On the evening of the day after Christmas in 1883, Lucius died mysteriously. A few days later, when the members of the family opened his bedroom closet and took the lid off the hat box, guess what they found? An empty hat box? Suggested Johnny. The professor shook his head solemnly. No, guess again. I give up, said Johnny. Fergie shrugged. Okay, it's a trick question. They found the skull, right? The professor's eyebrows rose, and he made a puckery face. Well, yes and no. That is, they found the skull, but they didn't know they had found the skull. Huh? Said Fergie, gaping. In a flash, Johnny guessed. Oh, my God, he exclaimed, and he clapped his hand over his mouth. The professor turned to Johnny, and he made a little mock courteous bow. Go to the head of the class, young man. Yes, indeedy. What they found was a teeny tiny skull, the same one that wound up on the shelf by the fireplace in the dollhouse room that some of us here have seen. You ask, how could this be? Well, remember, Warren Windrow was a young warlock, and after he had gotten his revenge on Lucius, his evil disembodied mind had thought up a way to pass on the curse, and, since no one in the Childermass family knew that a full-size skull had been in the hat box, nobody guessed that the lovely, delicate miniature was a real skull. Johnny turned very pale. Cold beads of sweat formed on his forehead, and he realized that everyone was looking at him. He felt ashamed and hung his head. I should have got rid of it right away, he mumbled. I shouldn't have picked it up in the first place. The professor smiled and patted Johnny on the shoulder sympathetically. Don't be too hard on yourself, John, he said softly. The evil spirit of Warren Windrow probably intended for you to pick up the skull, and as you discovered later, it's not an easy matter to throw a thing like that away. But to continue with the story, Marcus Childermass, my father, took the skull away and kept it in his room, and under its evil influence he went to work on the Childermass clock. He'd had some experience in carpentry, so the idea wasn't totally... Wait, exclaimed Professor Coote, waving his hand in the air like a student who knows the answer. I think I've discovered a hole in the story. The professor folded his arms and pretended to look annoyed. Then he unexpectedly burst out laughing. Yes, I know you think you've found a hole, you insufferable pedant. But I'll plug it for you. You wait. You want to know how come my father didn't get blitzed by the power of Windrow's skull, and the answer is this. He never touched it. His fingers never actually came in contact with the filthy thing. I don't know for sure that this is the answer, I'm just guessing, but Dad was a meticulous, fussy man, a lot like this Mr. Finnick you folks have told me about, though I will hasten to add that my father was a good deal more warm-hearted. Anyway, I think Dad must have handled the skull with tweezers, and that was what saved him. I, on the other hand, was not so lucky. My finger grazed the skull that night in the Fitzwilliam Inn, and it nearly got me killed. I'm just lucky I have such good kind... The professor's voice trailed off, and he turned away. He was crying now, and he tried to cover it up with a fit of coughing and harumping. Professor Coote jumped up and ran off with the professor's handkerchief. He took it and blew his nose several times, and he muttered something about Russian cigarettes. Then everybody got up and went to the card table and stood by the brick stove and poured themselves more drinks. For a while after that, the partygoers just milled around and talked quietly. At a little after 10 o'clock, Grandma and Grandpa announced that it was bedtime for them. They thanked the professor for the party and ambled home arm in arm. Johnny and Fergie discussed their narrow escape for a while, and then Fergie went into the house to use the bathroom, and Johnny drifted over to the professor drifted over to join the professor, Father Higgins, and Professor Coote. The three men had wandered down to the far end of the backyard to look at the sad remains of the professor's vegetable garden. He had been away during the spring planting season, and the plot of ground was just a weed-grown mess. "By the way, Charlie," said the professor, "are you sure Finnick didn't have anything to do with this business? I mean, it's a bit hard for me to believe that he and his museum just happened to be out on Vinalhaven near the place where Warren Windrow lived. Isn't it possible that he's a member of the Windrow clan?" Professor Coote shook his head. "No, I don't think it's likely. Finnick is a pretty detestable person, I gather, but that doesn't make him a sorcerer. As unlikely as it may seem, his being out on Vinalhaven is exactly what it seems to be, a ridiculous, insane coincidence." The professor rubbed his chin and looked doubtful. "Well, Charlie," he said, "I know you're an expert on hocus-pocus and abracadabra, but still—" "Professor Coote," said Johnny, interrupting, "could I ask you something?" Professor Coote turned and smiled at Johnny. "Yes, John, you look upset. What is it?" Johnny wrinkled up his forehead and bit his lip. "Well, I was just wondering, that is, do you think the curse of the skull in the dollhouse and Warren Windrow is over for good?" Professor Coote sloshed the brandy snifter he was holding. Then he reached out and flicked some fluff off the top of the tall, stocky weed that was growing in the professor's garden. "I was afraid someone would ask me about that," he said in a grave, troubled voice, "and the answer is I don't know for sure. I am an expert on magic, but there is a lot I don't understand about it. However, I will say this. The curse was interrupted at the precise moment when it was supposed to have ripened. That is, Roderick here was to have been killed on the anniversary of the day and the hour when Warren Windrow met his end on the gallows. But at that point, our friend Father Higgins came charging in like a Notre Dame fullback, and he dispelled the curse by using the power of the true cross, and one of the oldest, most potent incantations in the world. By the way, Tom, where on earth did you dig that piece of wizardry up? I know it in Celtic, and in Old Icelandic, but I wasn't aware that it had been translated into English." Father Higgins sipped his whiskey and smiled. "It's part of an old hymn called St. Patrick's Breastplate. I've known it since I was a kid, but it never occurred to me that the thing might have magical properties until a couple of years ago. I was playing it over on the organ one night when nobody was in the church, and then it hit me, and I said to myself, this isn't a hymn, this is a charm, and darned if I wasn't right." Johnny swallowed hard. You mean you didn't know it would work when you came charging up the hill to save us?" Father Higgins shook his head. "I most certainly did not. I felt like it was too out in the night. I was coming to bat with a toothpick in my hands, but we must never underestimate the power of invocations to the Blessed Trinity. Or the power of ancient Irish superstitions." "Oh, that's Professor Coote." "Or the power of ancient Irish superstitions," Professor Coote added, chuckling. "You see, John, magic is a rather uncertain science, or, as some would have it, a pseudo-science. So, to finish what I was saying earlier, if you and Roderick here will just manage to stay away from Cemetery Island for the rest of your lives, I don't think there'll be any problem." "Don't worry," muttered the professor as he sipped his sherry. "I'll give the place a wide berth. As for this summer, I plan to hang around Dunstan Heights and work on my golf game and listen to the Red Sox broadcast. In fact, I'll probably spend so much time with my ear glued to the radio that I'll never get my new book written." "Book?" said Johnny innocently. "I didn't know you were writing a book, Professor." The professor glared. "Of course I'm writing a book, or rather I was, until I got whisked off to that island paradise off the coast of Maine. You remember the book, Charlie, the one on the causes of the Napoleonic Wars?" "Ah, yes," said Professor Coote, grinning mischievously. "That book. Well, Roderick, if you don't get it finished, it'll be a small loss. After all, who would ever want to read it?" "What?" roared the professor, waving his burning cigarette. "Do you dare insinuate that I, Roderick Childermass, Ph.D., could ever write a dull—" And still cranking good-naturedly, the professor began walking slowly up toward the house in the company of his friends. And that is the end of The Spell of the Sorcerer's Skull. But the story is not over, and it will continue in The Revenge of the Wizard's Ghost, which I will probably start reading you tomorrow.